Welcome, everyone, to the PFF Fantasy Podcast. I'm your host, Jon Macri, and today we have a fun episode's worth of discussion planned because we are talking about bounce back candidates. So, players who were maybe once great and then disappointed us last season, who we still believe in their potential to be great again in 2024. And joining me once again, someone who has never had any concerns about a dip in greatness. It's Kate Magdziuk. Kate, how's it going?
It is good. I'm so excited to be talking fantasy bounce back candidates because usually this is a area where you can find a ton of value in your fantasy drafts. Because you know what? People don't like being burned. I don't like being burned. You don't like being burned. People get a little bit of that PTSD in them once you get the ouchies from a player. So yeah, this can be like one of the most bountiful sources of fantasy points if you know where to look.
Yeah, I'm with you. This is a good way to kind of find reasons for optimism among players who, yeah, maybe when, people are drafting and sometimes they sort by fantasy points from last season, like there's definitely going to be some value in there. And it's always one of my favorite kind of topics to dig into each offseason because it does give us a chance to really be optimistic about players who did let us down the season prior. These are players who we believed in, and ultimately, whether it was due to injury or inefficiency, just couldn't live up to our expectations of them. And sometimes that does mean it's the new norm for these players. But I think for the 10 that we're going to highlight today, we say it shan't not be the end of their fantasy glory days, and we'll give some reasons as to why that is as we go through them here. So let's get into it and start with the first name on the list. One of your picks, Kate, at quarterback. It is Deshaun Watson of the Cleveland Browns. So Watson getting a lot of attention on this pod in recent weeks. He was on our Make or Break episode a couple weeks ago. Now he's your QB pick here for a bounce back candidate. So what makes Deshaun get on the list for you this season?
I mean, let's be honest. I know that we have not seen him be in his Houston Texans form here since he was traded to the Cleveland Browns. There have been a bunch of extenuating circumstances that I'm not going to elaborate much on here, but things kept him off the field, and then 2023 marred with injuries. I do think that, obviously this is a make or break season, but I'm looking at the circumstances around him. I'm looking at the addition of Joe Brady as offensive coordinator as a potential factor in, driving perhaps a bounce back season. I mean, generally speaking, I know that, the things weren't necessarily going super well for the Buffalo Bills before they moved on from Joe Brady last season, but you looked at their offensive production and actually they were pretty dang productive. They were struggling in the turnover category, which has been a major problem throughout Josh Allen's entire career, and I think that maybe poked the bear a little bit in terms of the ease of which they moved on from Joe Brady. But generally speaking, this was a pretty productive and a pretty efficient offense that I think got pretty unlucky when it comes to the turnover market. And I look at Joe Brady, I look at the fact that he's joining Kevin Stefanski, who's already a pretty solid offensive minded head coach. You look at the addition of Jerry Jeudy, who's, struggled, but still, has some potential, right? It has certainly at least upgraded the receiving core, I think, as far as, depth goes, at least arguably. Amari Cooper, one of my favorite players to draft in 2024, who's literally coming off a career year that nobody's talking about. I just think there are a lot of things that should be setting Deshaun Watson up for success, despite the fact that, yes, largely speaking, Deshaun Watson has absolutely struggled. And statistically, there's not a lot of things I can point to that are going to say that he's ready to bounce back. But I think the tools are there, right?
I think so. And yeah, I think it's one of those situations where, yeah, like obviously, he's not that top three passing quarterback that he was in 2020. He graded really well for us that year. But I think there's, like you said, there's potential on this roster as a whole, but also I think there's a path for him, like even with his rushing ability as well, too, right? Like there's other ways that he can kind of make up for that lack of efficiency and effectiveness as a passer, even though I'm with you. I do think it'll be better this season. But 4.3 runs per game last year, that's minus quarterback kneels and fumbled snaps and trips and things like that. That was right around where he was when he was a high-end fantasy quarterback, right? And now obviously he had the elite passing to go along with that. But I think that's kind of an area where I would be betting too, like on delivering more fantasy potential on top of adding a little bit more as a passer, even though, he's got decent weapons around him. I'm with you. I wanted to see at least some inkling of encouraging passing metrics from him these past two
I mean,
seasons. Yeah.
we can say there are a couple, right? Saw a pretty significant improvement in terms of PFF passing grade, increase from 51.0 in his first season with the Browns up to 66.8. Still not great.
Mhm.
Did see a very slight improvement in terms of his yards per attempt average. Saw a big time increase in big time throw rate, a decrease in the turnover worthy play rate. Like, and again, it's kind of, I say this all with a grain of salt because statistically, Deshaun Watson did move in the right direction in 2023. It's just that he was still average or below average in comparison to other quarterbacks. But even despite that, I mean, played 5 games, finished as a QB1, a top 10 QB in 3 of those 5 games that he started and finished. That's not too bad. Like,
Mhm.
considering the current value at where you can draft Deshaun Watson, I think that you can very easily probably paint the narrative that, like, yeah, if we continue to see even some marginal improvement in his passing metrics and efficiency, um, like Deshaun Watson and Amari Cooper were actually one of the most efficient passing duos, uh, passing receiver duos in the entire National Football League last year. You had the big time breakout of David Njoku. Of course, that was with Joe Flacco. We'll see if they try to force the toothpaste back in the tube. But like, everything feels like it should be trending up. I don't know.
It should
I don't
be.
know. I hated making this pick, but like, the more I see him fall down draft boards, the more I consider to
Yeah.
myself like, yeah, there's probably more upside than not when it comes to Deshaun Watson at his current value.
Yeah, and I'm with you. I think that's where a lot of the optimism can come from too. Like he's going as like QB 23 right now. So it's not like that value is going to burn you really in any kind of way if you do
Yes.
take him in that range, right? Like you said, a full season healthy on what I think is a good, really good roster, like top to bottom. It could definitely be a case where the rising tide lifts all ships, and his level of play ends up matching the Browns roster as a whole. Because again, like I mentioned on the Make or Break pod, like we literally just saw Joe Flacco have great fantasy success in that offense as well, without the threat of Nick Chubb at running back as well. So we know it's possible. It's just up to him to kind of deliver and stay healthy while doing so. So I don't mind that taking a shot on it. Like I have him as QB 22, so one spot ahead of QB 23 where he's being drafted. So I'm obviously fine taking him there. And yeah, there's maybe a case for him to go higher than that, but we don't really have to take him that high. So the
That's what
value is what keeps him safer.
Yeah, and like, let's be real. And I'm not saying that I'm expecting a bounce back to his,
Mhm.
top 5
Right.
QB ceiling, but would I be surprised at all if Deshaun Watson finishes as the QB 10 on the year? I would not
Right.
in the least.
Yep, I like it. Yeah, so my pick at quarterback is somebody that I am expecting to bounce back closer, at least to that QB5 form, top 5 QB. It's Joe Burrow of the Cincinnati Bengals. So feels like a pretty obvious choice, considering just how disappointing his 2023 season was for him. He appeared in just 10 games, averaged 15.5 fantasy points per game. Um, and 155.2 total fantasy points. That put him outside of the top 20 at his position. We know that he was dealing with the calf injury heading into the year. That seemed to affect his play early on, and then he had the wrist injury that ended his season after that, right? So we don't know about how much the effects of that wrist injury are going to linger into this season, but a decent amount of recovery time here since the injury and surgery. So I'm assuming, as a non-doctor, that he'll be okay and that we can get the Joe Burrow that we're used to back here for 2024. Um, just for reference, he was drafted as the QB5 last offseason, managed just 4 top 10 finishes across his 10 games played, finishing with 5 weekly finishes outside of the top 20 in 2023. So the injuries were clearly affecting like his level of play. His overall grade and passing grade last season, 77.9 and 76.8 respectively. They dropped pretty significantly from the previous 2 seasons. He was a top 3 graded quarterback in both of those categories for us in each of the past 2 years. He fell outside of the top 15 this past season due to those potential injuries and the struggles that came along with it. But I do want to point out, like in games where he kind of appeared to be over that calf injury, so weeks 5 to 11, he averaged 19.9 points per game and was the QB9 over that span, right? So I like his potential to bounce back. He's got Jamar Chase, T. Higgins back for another season. If he is fully healthy and if that wrist injury doesn't prove to be an issue, I think he can get back to that top 5-ish form. Like he's being drafted as QB7 right now in ADP. So pretty close to where he was last year at this time. I think based on, that we're pretty much all expecting kind of a bounce back year for Joe Burrow. So yeah, I'm feeling pretty good about him. I think it's an obvious choice, but I think it's one that I'm feeling pretty confident about.
It's definitely an obvious choice, and honestly, to take it one step further, I think it's kind of fair to just throw out week 11 entirely where he
Mhm.
suffered, the season-ending wrist injury. Weeks 5 through 10, averaged 21.4
Right.
fantasy points per game. So over that, 5-game span, averaged as the QB4 in fantasy points per game, finished as a top 8 quarterback in 4 of those 5 games. Like all in all, you look at Joe Burrow and his proficiency as a drop back passer, definitely made it a lot more difficult to evaluate him, just given the calf injury. But even in that span where I consider him to be fully healthy in that like weeks 5 to 10 range, ranked eighth in terms of fantasy points per drop back was really just looking back to form and really kind of hard to ignore the fact that like he had 300-yard passing games in that span, 2 touchdowns of 40 plus receiving yards. The only question for me, and maybe this is kind of a silly one, for Joe Burrow, how much do you care about T. Higgins in his presence in the offense? He is still not signed his franchise tag. He is not reported to mandatory minicamp because he has not signed that franchise tag. They're still kind of at a dead halt. And the more time that goes on, the more time I'm kind of like, oh, is there a realistic shot that T. Higgins signs his franchise tag with the notion being that they will tag and trade him? And he kind of forces his way out of Cincinnati because it doesn't seem like I think they want T. Higgins, and if they needed to make the finances work, I still think it's kind of difficult to do so. But like, if you want to go all in and give him the contract, it just seems like right now the relationship is fractured, kind of even beyond the money, right? Because the whole kind of conversation preceding the trade request is that he's upset that they're not even trying to get a deal done,
Mhm.
right? He's like, you're not even in the negotiating process. It's not like we're kind of hammering the table and we can't agree to a number. They're not even talking. Like, and that information preceded this trade request. So like all of that in consideration, I don't know how likely it is that T. Higgins actually will be traded here in 2024, but let's say if he is, does that or how much does that impact your view of Joe Burrow and his 2024 season?
Yeah, it probably does a bit, right? Like I mean, having two like high end wide receiver options obviously helps a quarterback's potential for production, right? So without T Higgins, I think there's probably some expectation of a decline in production, but I don't know if it's like a significant amount. Like I wouldn't be dropping him out of the top 10 or anything like that in my rankings. I still think Joe Burrow plus Jamar Chase is good enough to be considered a top 10 quarterback for fantasy. I mean, we'll see what Jermaine Burton looks like as well as the rookie that they brought in. They brought in Mike Gesicki, who, whatever. But like there's
Ooh.
options for it. There's options for him. As I was saying, Mike Gesicki, I was like, it's not like the biggest case, in his favor, but there are still, I think, options there. And even looking at Joe Burrow last year during that stretch where, weeks 5 to 10, like you said, like T. Higgins wasn't a huge part of the offense there either, and wasn't like, helping Joe Burrow's case to keep him afloat inside that top 10, but he still was in there. Obviously, the threat of him in the offense stuff definitely matters. And it does. It's not something you can ignore, I guess is what I'm trying to say. And I'm expecting Higgins to play out the year in Cincinnati. That's how I'm treating it right now. Like it just feels like the most likely scenario. And if you're Cincinnati, I guess there is the possibility that he could be traded, because do you really want to lose a player of that caliber for nothing at the end of his contract? I would be pretty surprised if they did. So yeah, it's a tricky situation. I think as the offseason goes on, I think it becomes more of a concern if Higgins isn't reporting to the team or anything like that. But I still kind of am. I mean, we'll talk about T Higgins in a little bit because I got him on this list, but I'm treating it right now as he's going to play out this year because he has to earn a contract as well. And last year was not a good year for him, so I think he's got a lot to prove on the field this season as well.
Yeah, I mean, T. Higgins definitely in kind of a precarious position, just given the the timing of this down year. It really, really, really hurt him. I
Mhm.
think in this whole contract negotiation process, and at a time when he wants to demand this, wide receiver one money, and very much needs to kind of prove that, especially being teammates with Jamar Chase. Like that made it all the more complicated. But um, just like something that just is in the back of my mind, and it continues to kind of eke forward the every day that goes by that T. Higgins is not in the building signing his franchise tag, because it really feels like right now he's kind of leveraging that, right? And
Mhm.
he's it doesn't seem like he's coming in anytime soon to sign that franchise tag unless it's with the condition that it's a sign and trade.
Right.
And that scares me a little bit. Maybe more so for Joe Burrow's ceiling than his floor. I think his floor as a passer pretty darn safe, but generally, I think seeing that top 5 upside without T. Higgins on the field, at least a healthy T. Higgins, feels less in the realm of possibility. But there's no doubt that Joe Burrow is a top bounce back candidate for
Mhm.
2024, regardless.
Yeah. Yeah. Great points for sure. Um, okay, let's talk about some running backs here. And we got 3 running backs, and interestingly, all of them are on new teams this year. So, Kate, we'll start with your first pick at the running back position. You went with Josh Jacobs, now of the Green Bay Packers. So, what's got Josh Jacobs on your bounce back list this year?
Josh Jacobs is such an enigma for me. I really, I've got a lot of mixed feelings about Josh Jacobs. Now, the Raiders ranked middle of the pack with a 65.2 PFF run blocking grade, but that didn't matter. He had help from, at least a decent amount of help from his offensive line. Didn't have a low percentage of yards coming before or, a high percentage. He got help is all I'm saying. It wasn't the worst. And though the offense was inefficient, which I think definitely hurt Josh Jacobs, it was just like the most catastrophic season that we could have possibly imagined for Josh Jacobs. I mean, across the board, career lows, despite the fact that, again, like he got the volume, right? And he had 5 games of 20 plus rush attempts. Like, he was the king of volume, and yet he still only had 2 games of 100 plus rushing yards, averaged a career low 3.5 yards per carry, career low PFF rushing grade 70.1, career low in terms of yards after contact per attempt. It was a disaster. It was an absolute disaster. Now, what I keep going back to in this circumstance is the interesting fact that this is, without a doubt in my mind, the best offense that Josh Jacobs has ever played on in his career. So I don't know if he's washed, right? He definitely looked washed in 2023, coming off of a rushing title, but one that was kind of fueled by just absolutely massive usage. Like, I don't know if he's washed, but I do think that the offense in Green Bay is going to be one that is going to yield a lot of efficiency that I don't necessarily think helped Josh Jacobs' case at all. So maybe there's a little bit of, kind of a split backfield here. The Packers have a pretty interesting schedule. Josh Jacobs ranks among the top running backs in terms of strength of schedule through the first 10 weeks of the season here using our PFF strength of schedule metric. But I think, like, regardless of who they mix in, he's probably the goal line guy, right? He's probably going to be the primary running back, even if Marshawn Lloyd mixes in, maybe AJ Dillon gets some touches, but, like, generally speaking, I think he's going to be the primary running back on an offense that I think is going to score a lot of points. And I think that's something that's pretty valuable. So, like, even if he's not as efficient as we once saw him, I still think he probably bounces back in terms of fantasy production in general.
Yeah, I think that's fair. And look, he's being drafted as a top 10 running back again this season. So I think people are buying into the bounce back potential because, I mean, if not for that volume last year, like you said, like, he wasn't anywhere close to a top 10 back, right? So a couple of things, like, I think for Jacobs, like you mentioned, being in that offense definitely helps. And I don't think he's going to see the volume in Green Bay that he did in Vegas last season, right? Like, he was at 21.9 opportunities per game. So that's carries plus targets. That was tied with Christian McCaffrey and Saquon Barkley as top 5 marks in the league. But, you know, there's going to be a little bit more competition in the backfield. Marshawn Lloyd, AJ Dillon, those guys are going to mix in there more than the Vegas backs did last year. So I'm definitely with you in that. I think overall the offense is going to be better. I think that's probably going to lead to him being more effective and efficient running the ball than he was last season, which, like you laid out, a pretty clear drop off from his career norm. So I don't think he's washed. I think, still relatively young as well at 26 years old, in that better offense for touchdown potential. Like, I maybe don't buy him as, like, exactly like a top 10 running back like ADP suggests right now, but I could see it being pretty close. So I think, top 12 is kind of fine with me right now. So I'm in on Josh Jacobs.
Yeah, and I mean, even in terms of, like, looking at, the red zone carries, right? Ranked 15th among running backs in terms of total red zone carries. And I think, again, probably a lot of that came to do with the fact that, the Raiders didn't have nearly as many scoring opportunities as I project the Packers to have in 2024. He ranked 23rd in terms of carries inside the 5. You know who he was tied for in with 10 carries inside the 5-yard line last year? Backup running back AJ Dillon.
Mm.
Like, if he even gets close, to maybe 20 carries inside the 5, I think, for whatever it's worth, whatever level of efficiency he posts, it's going to be somewhat improved, even if it's not prime Josh Jacobs. And I think that, maybe he doesn't reach that ceiling. He's being drafted, honestly, a little higher than I probably expected after that disastrous season. But again, I think people are just looking at this as a prime opportunity for a bounce back in a very plus situation with this Green Bay crowd.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it makes sense. I think it's a good spot for him, and yeah, I'm with you. I don't think he'll be nearly as ineffective as he was last year, because he just does have a better offensive situation around him. So I can buy into that for sure. So my running back, one of my running back picks here was Aaron
This is
Jones
a good
of
one.
the Minnesota Vikings, right? So I think this one, people might have a harder time getting on board with because he is on the older side for a running back, 29 years old, right? Plus he's coming off a year where he did deal with injuries that, cut into his playing time. Ultimately finished as the PPR RB 41 by the end of the year, right? So obviously a huge difference from finishing as the PPR RB 7 in 2022. But I did find some optimism from him, like just a strong finish to the year with his overall rushing metrics in that very Green Bay offense that, again, should help Josh Jacobs' efficiency. I at least found some reasons for optimism for a bounce back for Aaron Jones here, who's now on Minnesota. So he finished 2023 with an 81.5 rushing grade, that ranked 14th at his position. So that was weeks 15 to 18. So it's only a 4 game sample there, but 14th at his position after missing a number of weeks prior to week 15. When he was fully healthy, it seemed like in with week 15. Sorry, he finished with 81.5 for the year. From week 15 to week 18, he posted an 89 rushing grade, which ranked third at the position, 3.70 yards after contact per attempt, which was ninth, and 0.24 missed tackles forced per attempt, which was tied for 14th. So
He
he
looked like
ranked
a
out.
different running back.
He really did.
It,
Like
it
he was
totally.
outside the top 40 at his position in those metrics prior to that stretch there, right? So he really was dealing with injuries, dealing with some, you know, playing time issues because of the injuries. So that definitely played a part, right? And it's a smaller sample size. There's no doubt about that at the end of the year, but like I'm not expecting him to, bounce back to top 10 PPR form or anything like that, but I do like the potential value for him as RB 19 at the moment in drafts. So, it's on a Vikings offense as well, like where the backfield doesn't really offer much competition for touches. He only carried the ball 12 times per game last year, in Green Bay. I think, for Minnesota, I think that number goes up for him. Plus, he only had 3 touchdowns in 2023. So I like Minnesota's offense. I know it's a rookie quarterback, but I think that potential for touchdowns as well is going to go up here in 2024, more than 3 anyways. But health, it's going to be the major factor for Aaron Jones. We know that for a running back entering a 29 age season, like that's the case for every player, really. Health, that should go without saying. So assuming we can get 13 to 14 games from him, I like his chances to be in that steady RB2 conversation on a weekly basis, this season. So yeah, I know not everybody's going to be in love with him. Again, we talked about that at the top about people being burned by players before. Where are you at with Aaron Jones? Like, you buy
I
into this, or are you out?
I'm so far in on Aaron Jones just in general. Like I can't believe that this is even a discussion. The gap in ADP, by the way, between Aaron Jones and Josh Jacobs, I think is
Mm,
absolutely astounding. Definitely had some struggles, and I'm not here to, necessarily deny that. Like, yeah, there were some big challenges that you saw Aaron Jones have to overcome in this season where he was not fully healthy, right? You mentioned it, not a ton of touchdown production. Um, generally just didn't have a ton of upside. But then you looked at how strong he was to finish out that season, despite those health struggles early on. He finished with 100 plus rushing yards in each of his last 5 games played. So that includes the wild card round, that includes the divisional round. It scored 3 touchdowns against that Dallas Cowboys defense in the wild card. Um, like there was a lot to like about Aaron Jones, and I think the injuries that kind of muddled his early season have very much painted the picture, which it's almost like the opposite of recency bias for Aaron Jones, and I'm not really sure what we're doing because all in all, I don't think you can really ignore that, you know Aaron Jones looked fan freaking tastic, and he did not look 29 years old. He didn't look 28 years old. He looked like a spry chicken to close out the year. The efficiency metrics match it tenfold. And I think this Minnesota offense is going to be a lot better than people are expecting. I don't think that there's really much of any competition. Like maybe Ty Chandler is going to mix in for some occasional, spell him a little bit, but like Aaron Jones, I could easily see finishing as a top 12 fantasy running back, and I would not bat an eye as long as he's healthy.
Yeah, love that. Yeah, the health is the main thing, right? Like people hate, betting on guys again who dealt with injuries. Like that bothers people more than anything else. But I'm with you. I think if he is healthy, he
He's still been
definitely.
relatively healthy the past
Yeah,
couple
he
seasons, though.
has.
15
Yep.
games in 2021, played a full season in 2022. Like he's been relatively healthy
Mhm.
even as he's aged, and I don't know. I'm not going to
Yeah.
hold the beginning of the year against him. Now, like let's say he had started the year hot and then kind of broke down as the year went on, that would be more concerning
Mhm.
for me. But it's literally the opposite script. So, what are fantasy managers doing drafting him as low as they are? It just doesn't make sense to me, especially considering the current price that they're willing to pay up for Josh Jacobs, who had a much worse season despite being healthy for most of the early portions of it. Aaron Jones, RB19, smash, smash. Yes.
Nice, love it. Yeah, I'm in on this. I like Aaron Jones quite a bit there. So let's talk about one more running back here, and another one going to a new team. It is Tony Pollard of the now Tennessee Titans. So speaking of players that burned fantasy managers last year, myself included, like Tony Pollard was also very ineffective on the field. Not anywhere close to what we've come to expect from him in seasons prior. Like we talked about it, I think, on our most disappointing players podcast at the end of the season. Like he just wasn't anywhere near what our expectations of him were, right? Like that we were kind of considering him that potential top 5 running back. And, I'm not even saying that's the expectation this year. Not even really close, but I still like his chances for just a better and more efficient season. And, to be fair to Pollard, like I think it was always going to be difficult to kind of replicate his efficiency on that significantly larger workload. But the hope was that he would at least come close to that performance level and deliver, a comfortable top 12 finish at the position. Unfortunately, last year, slow start to the year, lack of touchdowns. Man, it's just an RB15 finish with a disappointing, I think, 12.9 fantasy points per game through 17 weeks. So this year joins a new team, taking over for Derrick Henry in Tennessee there as their lead back. And I think the opportunity to outperform his current ADP, which is RB23 right now on Sleeper. So one of the key factors I think, to kind of for him to bounce back this season is just going to be to capitalize on his opportunities near the goal line. He converted just 4 touchdowns in goal to go situations in 2023, despite 26 opportunities in those situations. So he ranked 51st in first down and touchdown rate among running backs in those situations. So obviously not good numbers there. That is definitely a reason for, positive regression. The other key factor for him, I think, will just be an overall return to form, right? After his broken leg in the 2022 playoffs, I think that contributed to that slow start for him in 2023, but he was much better in the back half of the year. So he ranked 39th in PFF rushing grade from weeks 1 to 10 with a 65.8, and he was the PPR RB17 over that span. But then from weeks 11 to 18, he was PFF's top graded running back with a 90.8 and the PPR RB7 to close out the year. So I like that encouraging, stretch there as he kind of got healthier. And I'm not even saying like the Titans 2024 offense is going to be as strong as the 2023 Cowboys or anything like that, but they did,
I think it's going to
get
be a
some
good one.
yeah,
Like,
get some help this season. It's not going to be bad. They, I think it should be a lot better than what it was last year, and I think that helps increase those potential scoring opportunities for Pollard as well, right? Like I'm sure he's going to cede, receiving down work to Tajay Spears. I don't think there's much of a question about that, but still plenty of opportunities for him to carry the ball, show that he's kind of better than that RB23 ADP. And like I have him as RB20 right now, so it's not like crazy high or anything like that, but that's kind of what the expectation for him, I think, should be if he's sharing those, receiving down work with Tajay Spears. But yeah, I like Pollard to bounce back, even if he never lives up to that, RB8 ADP or whatever it was last offseason. I still think he's better than what he showed on the whole of last season, basically.
Yeah, weeks 11 through 18 were kind of like the key for me, right?
Mhm.
You look at the PFF rushing grade, which you mentioned, 90.8. Saw an increase in his yards per carry average, ranked second in missed forced tackle rate, sixth in yards after contact per attempt, seventh in terms of first down touchdown rate. Like, second half of the season, he was extremely efficient in pretty much every metric we can analyze. Didn't necessarily translate to a ton of fantasy upside. I think part of that was that lack of conversion, that lack of touchdown scoring, which can be kind of volatile anyway. You look at the Titans, I think there's going to be, they're probably one of the sneakiest offenses in the league, I think, heading into 24. Like, I think, Will Levis got a cannon of an arm. That's going to put them in some interesting spots. You have the addition of Calvin Ridley. You have Tyler Boyd, who I think is an excellent safety blanket. Tajay Spears heading into year two. DeAndre Hopkins, who didn't appear to lose much of a step, despite kind of a disappointing season in DeAndre Hopkins terms. Like, they invested in the offensive line. They've got JC Latham, signed Lloyd Cushenberry. Like, this Titans offense is going to be very sneaky. And I really like Tajay Spears. I pointed him out in an article just a couple weeks ago of a potential, sleeper candidate, especially with the signing of Tony Pollard, based on his PFF stable metrics being so encouraging. I think there's room for both of these running backs to
Mhm.
eat, but I think Tony Pollard's second half of the year efficiency is what seals the deal for me. Um, in what should be a pretty decent offense. Like, I don't think, if I'm projecting, you know, my projections, like, I don't think the Titans finish as a bottom 10 offense in 2024, and that's not even in the realm of possibilities in my brain right now.
Yeah, no, I think that makes sense. And then bringing in Brian Callahan, I think it is as well, right? Like, I think there's definitely potential there with that offense. And yeah, I mean, RB20 for Tony Pollard. Like, I
Smash.
think I'm with you. I like Tajay Spears as well. But that's kind of where I have him. Like, if it wasn't for Tajay Spears just being so good and effective at that receiving down back, like as that receiving down back, like I think there's an argument for Pollard to be even higher, probably closer to that Josh Jacobs range, because Josh Jacobs doesn't necessarily have that clear receiving down back to contend with in Green Bay. But Pollard, I still like his potential for the carries around the goal line as well on a what should be, like you said, a good offense this season.
Let's
So
go.
we'll see. A lot depends on Will Levis and taking that step in year two, but I think they put enough around him to make it happen. So we'll see how it shakes out.
Love it.
Let's talk about some wide receivers here. And we got three wide receivers. All of them are on the same team as they were last year. So, well, for now, anyways, we'll see what happens with T. Higgins. But let's start at the top here with one of your picks of the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. It's Chris Godwin.
Yeah, Chris Godwin, very interesting kind of valuation right now. I think in general for the Tampa Bay Buccaneers wide receivers, like, we're just kind of too far down on all of them in general, especially given what we saw out of Baker Mayfield in year one. With a new hit, offensive system coming in, maybe that changes things a little bit. But what I'm most excited about for Chris Godwin is the fact that he is moving back to the slot in 2024 after 2023, when he played primarily as a boundary wide receiver, which that is where he started his career. And let's be honest, like, got off to a relatively slow start. Didn't necessarily see that true breakout until they moved him as a primary slot receiver. And that's where he absolutely flourished. But You look at the overall efficiency of Chris Godwin in 2023 with 37.4% of snaps coming out of the slot. Averages 4.5 yards after the catch per reception in comparison to a 5.3 yard average, tied for a career low 1.73 yards per route run. Disappointing catch rate 76.4 after, being at a 70+% catch rate over each of the last 4 seasons prior in the slot. I think Chris Godwin probably an easy lock for another 120, 130 yard or 120, 130 target season. And if he catches a higher percentage of those, which I do project moving him back into the slot, he's going to be a PPR dream, absolute dream. And yeah, I don't see any realm of possibility where we don't both see an increase in his overall efficiency, but just putting him back at what I think is more of his natural position is going to be so key for both his floor and his upside for fantasy.
Yeah, I really like this call, because it was a quiet year for Chris Godwin last year, right? Like you said, like
I think people
PPR
are just
wide receiver.
bored of Chris Godwin. Like,
It
they're
could
so
be,
sick
yeah.
of getting 1,100 plus receiving yards. Like, it's boring.
And to be fair, like he was a little boring last year, right? Like PPR wide receiver 30, despite playing all 17 games, right? So I love the call for him to move back into the slot because you're right. He was just so much more effective there. It's not like he's going to be the odd man out in 2 wide receiver sets either, right? It's still gonna be him and Mike Evans as the primaries. But the Bucks were ninth in the league last year, 11 personnel rate at 71.4%. So that's a lot of work for Godwin out of the slot there. Baker Mayfield also targeted the slot at an above average rate last season, 30.7% of his targets in that direction. Like it just opens up for Godwin, who is a more versatile player, more polished route runner, to just do more with his snaps. And I think that's definitely going to lead to him seeing the ball more and getting some more favorable matchups as well. Like last year, 2.11 yards per route run out of the slot compared to 1.63 out wide. So he just was more effective in that role. So I think it's smart for them to lean back into that role for him this year. Going as wide receiver 38 right now on Sleeper. So again, another guy that
Right.
there's value there, right? Like he's not going to burn you at that cost. So he's definitely worth the click at that position.
Yeah, I'm all in. I think the people are probably really underrating what moving him back into the slot could do for, again, both his fantasy production, his overall efficiency. But I think that catch rate is going to be,
Mhm.
pretty significant in terms of his, PPR upside here in 2024. All
Yeah.
in.
Yeah, I like it. All right, let's go to okay. I got a wide receiver pick here. This one might burn people because of the cost to get him, but it's Garrett Wilson of the New York Jets, who maybe doesn't fit the bounce back criteria as perfectly as I would like because he's only played 2 seasons in the NFL. Both of them were fairly comparable, finishing as PPR wide receiver 21 as a rookie. He was wide receiver 22 last year. Slightly more receiving yards and touchdowns in 2022, but that's not going to be a noticeable difference if he puts up 2022 numbers compared to 2023. So that being said, I didn't also want to call the offensive rookie of the year from 2022 a breakout candidate because he's already kind of broken out. So I had to shoehorn him in here somewhere. And really, I think this is more just kind of a bounce back of expectations as a player who was drafted as a wide receiver 1 last year and is going to be again this year. So obviously, you look at him and his season in 2023, the fantasy struggles there were almost exclusively due to poor quarterback play, which was not the expectation for him heading into the season after the team traded for Aaron Rodgers, who lasted only 4 offensive snaps before tearing his Achilles tendon. But Garrett Wilson ranked 111th at his position in catchable target rate, and ranked just 22nd in receiving yards with 1,042. So that's despite ranking 4th in total targets with 163. Like that is it's just a sad discrepancy to look at for Garrett Wilson. Like he faced similar issues as a rookie as well, like 112th in catchable target rate, but he at least still managed a little bit more receiving yards and more receiving touchdowns than he did last year. So I think for me, his bounce back and breakout potential really comes from just Aaron Rodgers, right?
Yeah.
That is the absolute key. And I think, he owns a top 10 ADP at his position right now. It's risky because it depends almost entirely on the health of Aaron Rodgers to throw him the ball and keep him efficient. Otherwise, if Aaron Rodgers gets hurt, or I don't know what he's doing right now, not being in camp, but there's a lot of risk. There's a lot tied and banking on Aaron Rodgers. So if Rodgers can be on the field, if he can overcome, being a 40-year-old quarterback coming off an Achilles injury, and just be, what he was in 2022, right? Like not MVP candidate Aaron Rodgers, but also closer to that top 12 range at his position. Like that is what gives Garrett Wilson the potential to have this top 10 season. If not, and if he's injured again, we kind of have to hope that Tyrod Taylor is going to be better than Zach Wilson, which I also think is kind of safe to assume, but it's just a matter of how much better he can be. So a riskier pick here, but Garrett Wilson, he made the list more just because of that bounce back for expectations more than anything else for this season.
I mean, the good news is you don't have to necessarily be Aaron Rodgers in his prime to be that much better than Zach Wilson.
Yeah, exactly.
Right. Like, so even if Aaron Rodgers comes back and he is the Aaron Rodgers that we saw in 2022, right, which was kind of this disappointing version of Aaron Rodgers that you kind of had this question mark, is he still the Aaron Rodgers? Is he still MVP Aaron Rodgers? Like, even if he's not MVP Aaron Rodgers, he's Aaron Rodgers, and he's going to be a significant upgrade on Garrett Wilson. Like at this point in his career, he wasn't overly reliant on his mobility, so like that's a good thing. Like we've seen him kind of cut back on a lot of those types of plays that we maybe saw earlier in his career with his legs. I think this is one of those really high-end picks that I'm going to be all in on, and like just hope that I don't get burned, because if you get burned, right, it's not necessarily going to be Garrett Wilson, it's going to be the Jets depth chart that burns you once again. And so it's really just a matter of like, can you live with the Jets depth chart being the reason for a disappointing season? But then again, you look at the disappointing and you say like, okay, the floor is pretty much 1,100 receiving yards with Garrett Wilson, period. Like,
yeah. Hey, he's wide receiver 8 in ADP. That's exactly where I have him as well. Like it's a risk, obviously, being tied to Aaron Rodgers with the health and the age, but Aaron Rodgers is also still one of the best quarterbacks of all time, right? So, I mean, he just has to be good. He just has to be, closer to that Aaron Rodgers that we saw in 2022, and I can buy into that 100%. So, one more wide receiver on the bounce back list for me is T. Higgins. We've touched on him. We've kind of hinted at him a little bit here, but I couldn't have T. Higgins in my bounce back picks if I also was going to have Joe Burrow. So definitely got to include him in here. But again, like that 2023 season for the Bengals, the duo specifically of Burrow and Higgins, it was just not nearly what fantasy managers have come to expect from the two of them, really. And so much, I think, of the blame for T. Higgins' down year can also kind of be attributed to the status of Joe Burrow, right? Now, not entirely, because Higgins was dealing with a fractured rib early in the year as well. I think that likely contributed to his down year a little bit as he played through that injury. But I do think Burrow's struggles were more likely the key here in 2023, right? So through the first 10 games of the year, when Burrow was in the lineup, Higgins saw just a 65.3% catchable target rate, which at that point in the season ranked 99th among 124 qualifying wide receivers. And what's crazy is that percentage actually increased to 76% with Burrow out for the rest of the year and with Jake Browning throwing the ball. And that it was just much closer to what it was in 2022 when Burrow played every game and when he was healthy, which was 77.9%. So that year, with Burrow healthy, Higgins finished as a PPR wide receiver 17 overall. Obviously, clearly better than the wide receiver 47 finish this past year. But even looking at the splits and Higgins like receiving production with a more accurate Jake Browning last year, he improved his receiving grade from 66.9 to 72.3. His receiving yards per game went from 46.8 to 65.6. His yards per route run went from 1.41 to 2.01. And he had one more touchdown in there as well in two fewer games than he did with Joe Burrow. So I think what's more interesting about that is that, he saw the ball at a lower rate under Jake Browning, 15.3% target rate with Browning at quarterback compared to 21% with Joe Burrow at quarterback. So again, another player that their bounce back hinges a lot on the quarterback situation and obviously still being on the team. But Joe Burrow regaining his form, I think, is going to be exactly the recipe that T. Higgins needs to bounce back here. So I don't really have any concerns for him, assuming that he's going to be on the team and that Joe Burrow is back to health. Like those are the two key factors, and maybe they are big ifs, but I'm a believer in T. Higgins' talent, and I think that if we go into the season with him on the roster and playing and active, then I'm all in on a bounce back for sure.
Yeah, and I think, so much of this will hinge on just like the health component. I think all of these are super fair points for T. Higgins. And like just we need him on the field though.
Yeah,
And we need him to
yeah.
be healthy. And that's really the only thing. And we kind of mentioned this like with Aaron Jones and people being like hesitant to buy in because of the health component. Like
Mhm.
T. Higgins, honestly, like his health is much more concerning to me than even that of a 29-year-old Aaron Jones. And that I feel like kind of says something about where we're at with T. Higgins. But when he's healthy, I think it's really hard to imagine 15 other players that have more upside than T. Higgins on a week to week basis, especially with Joe Burrow, who's a top quarterback in the league. Like it's very simple as long as he is fully healthy. But you know what is a bummer? We don't really have a lot of insight as to that right
Mhm.
now because he's not on the field. And
Yeah.
is that going to impact his level of conditioning? If I don't know, obviously players do their own conditioning when they're away from the team and what have you. But like, does that create any additional injury risk in 2024? I don't know. If I do get burned one more time by T. Higgins, I'm probably going to be out, and
Yeah.
not even necessarily based on like production and efficiency, but just if I get burned from an injury standpoint. But
Mhm.
like T. Higgins, if he's on the field and healthy, then yes, he's going to be one of the biggest bounce back candidates in 2024.
Yeah, no, I agree. There's definitely the risk there, right? And it is kind of baked into his price right now as well, like wide receiver 28 on sleeper. So it's not terrible. Like I have him a bit
Honestly,
higher than that.
this is random, but like we talked about, I think it was on last week's show, how Christian Watson, like T. Higgins, his main issue has been hamstring injuries.
Mm,
Maybe he should go see that doctor that Christian Watson saw. And
maybe
maybe
he's
one
got
of his
the yeah.
legs is just like so much bigger than the others, right? Like maybe one of his hamstrings is just so much bigger than the others. And he's literally pulling a Christian Watson. I just pulled it up, 5 right hamstring injuries
Oh my
since he
god,
entered the league. Like
that's insane. It
that's
could be.
pretty
Maybe that's the
crazy.
key. Maybe that is the key. Maybe it is that weird
Go
unevenness
measure
thing
your muscle, T.
that
Come on.
maybe that's why he's not at camp. He's getting his muscles measured.
Yes. It's
Let's hope.
important, apparently.
It is, yeah. I mean, obviously played a part there, right, with Watson. So, yeah, it's there's always the risk. I think with T. Higgins, we've seen him get banged up in games, leave the game, come back, be hurt again, right? Like there's risk there, but yeah, again, everything banks on health for every single player for
Yeah.
fantasy football, right? So we're gonna try to be. I'm going to try to be optimistic, at least, that he can get healthy and have one of those big years in a contract season as well. So we shall see. Let's talk about a couple tight ends here. Um, Kyle Pitts of the Atlanta Falcons made your bounce back list. I think this is a great pick. I think a lot of people are definitely expecting it from Kyle Pitts this year. So why don't you explain why Kyle Pitts makes the bounce back list for you?
I mean, it all comes down to the quarterback play, right? Even, Kirk Cousins coming off a ruptured Achilles is better than Desmond Ritter and Taylor Heineke. Last year, among the 49 quarterbacks with 100 or more pass attempts, Desmond Ritter had the ninth lowest plus accurate throw rate. Taylor Heineke ranked dead last in that cohort. Heineke had the third highest uncatchable inaccurate throw rate. Ritter ranked 16th in that cohort, with the highest, with 16th highest uncatchable and accurate throw rate. Um, like you look at just the overall production here for Kyle Pitts last year also wasn't, in addition to having a big problem at quarterback, he was also coming off a pretty complicated knee injury. When he initially suffered the knee injury back in 2022, it was labeled as an MCL injury. Apparently, there were multiple ligaments that he had repaired that off season. And at the end of the year, he posted some sort of social media post that kind of implied, like, yes, he played, but he was not healthy Kyle Pitts in the 2023 season. So I think that's something to consider as well. But again, you look at, the fact that he ranks almost dead last in terms of catchable target rate, like that's going to be massively, massively improved here in 2024. And I can't stop thinking about the fact that like Kyle Pitts is a really good tight end. I don't know. Like, come on.
Yeah, this like it just feels like he has to this year, right? Like he hasn't come close to getting back to that 1,000 yard season as a rookie, and injuries have played a part of it. But I mean Arthur Smith as well, right? I think has kind of been the primary antagonist to Kyle Pitts fantasy managers, right? Like with him out of the picture, I think we're all pretty optimistic for this season with Kirk Cousins coming in as well. Like we talked about it in the make or break episode as well. Like Kyle Pitts has to deliver this year. So I'm with you in that. I think he absolutely will. I get why some fantasy managers might be out on this idea after, being burned a couple years in a row. But yeah, Kirk Cousins at quarterback. You got Raheem Morris as head coach. Like there's legitimate reason to be excited about him over what he was getting last year with Desmond Ritter, Taylor Heineke, Arthur Smith. Like it can't happen again. It won't. It won't happen again. Kyle Pitts is bouncing back 100%.
He is bouncing back. I mean, let's not forget among tight ends with 50 or more targets, his 82.8 PFF receiving grade and 2.02 yards per route run average both rank top two among rookie tight ends dating back to 2010.
Mm-hmm.
Kyle
Yeah.
Pitts as a rookie was unfreaking beatable. And he's still that same player,
Yeah.
but he has played through a lot of challenging circumstances in the last 2 years that I don't think are issues any
Mhm.
longer for this Atlanta Falcons offense.
Yep. Nope. I couldn't agree more. One more tight end
I
to
like this
consider a
one.
bounce back. Okay, good. Yeah, I was gonna say, hopefully this one gets excited, gets that terrible towel waving behind you. Cause yeah, I went with Pat Fryermuth of the Pittsburgh Steelers, who let's be honest, like 2023 was a disaster for Fryermuth because the guy was essentially a ghost in that offense. Like he went from finishing as the PPR tight end 7 in 2022 to posting just 6.4 fantasy points per game as the PPR tight end 30 through 11 games last year.
Because they didn't target the middle of the
They
field.
didn't use him at all, right? Like he was nowhere to be seen. Outside of that one game in week 12, right, where it was his only game all year in which he recorded more than 3 receptions, and it also happened to be the week that he finished as the overall tight end one, right? So 15.9% target rate last year, like that was not great, especially considering how heavily he was involved the year prior. He saw 22.1% target rate, and then he had 8 games that year where he had more than 3 receptions. So obviously, again, another stark difference there. I think there's even an argument like that his tight end 7 finish in 2022 could have been better with more touchdown luck, right? Like he saw 21 targets in the red zone that year and only came away with 2 touchdowns, which was the fewest among tight ends who saw more than 20 red zone targets. So touchdowns again, like they were hard to come by in 2023 for Fryermuth as well. But it was like only one of many issues that plagued him that season, including the offense as a whole, just underperforming and finishing bottom 5 in the league in touchdown percentage. So like I'm as someone who's not even the Steelers fan on this podcast, I'm really hopeful and buying into a bounce back year for Fryermuth. And I think it starts with a couple things like new quarterback in Russell Wilson and a new approach on offense with Arthur Smith coming in as the offensive coordinator. And we just talked about Arthur Smith being bad for Kyle Pitts, but I think this is a reason for optimism for somebody like Pat Fryermuth because the biggest reason for that is that the Falcons, Arthur Smith's Falcons, over the past 3 seasons, ranked top 3 in the NFL in overall target rate to the tight end. In each of those past 3 seasons, they ranked first in 2021 at 26.5% and first in 2023 with 30.2%. So I know Kyle Pitts managers probably punching their YouTubes right now because it didn't translate that well for him. But I think there is a clear difference in the two players and how they're utilized, right? Because Fryermuth is more of that traditional inline tight end, which was the more utilized position in Arthur Smith's offense. His teams ranked third in tight end target rate from an inline alignment since 2021. So that was something that Kyle Pitts just rarely did for Atlanta. He only spent 29.5% of his snaps from an inline alignment since 2021, while Fryermuth over that span spent 67.9% of his snaps from that alignment, right? So he's just, I think, a better fit for Arthur Smith's offense and that tight end heavy offense than Kyle Pitts was. And then you add in that Deontay Johnson isn't there, who's been the team's top target earner on a per route basis essentially every year that he's been with the team. He's now off to Carolina. I love Pat's chances here of bouncing back, being drafted as tight end 17 right now. So no concerns really about being burned by the value there. Just, I think, a nice, comfortable pick in that range for me.
Yeah, love this pick. And it's kind of interesting because, like, I feel like even the narrative around Russell Wilson is like, well, we haven't really seen him use the tight end position. He hasn't really used the middle of the field. I'm going to be honest, based on like a personnel standpoint, like what would entice him to utilize the tight end position more heavily? He's like thrown to, I don't know, Jacob Hollister, Gerald Everett, Greg Dulcich, Nick Vanette. Like, are these guys you're going to be funneling, as primary targets in your offense? No. Like, those guys wouldn't entice me to throw across the middle of the field either. But you know who he did throw to and he threw to a lot? Jimmy Graham. Like, let's go back to 2015, 2016, 2017 when Jimmy Graham was a top end fantasy asset. Like Jimmy Graham, 2016, 95 targets from Russell Wilson that year resulted in 923 yards and 6 touchdowns. Had 10 touchdowns from Jimmy Graham in 2017. Like, we know that Russell Wilson can throw to the tight end position. I'm just going to make the argument that since, Jimmy Graham had declined and not been as efficient, in his older age, he left the offense and then like it was just kind of a hodgepodge at the position. They never really found an answer. And then, Noah Fant, who maybe could have been a good option for Russell Wilson in Denver, went to Seattle in the trade. Like, I think that this is a great situation for Pat Fryermuth, especially considering like they don't really have a wide receiver 2
Mhm.
on this offense, right? That wide receiver 2 could very feasibly be Pat Fryermuth. Just yesterday, Russell Wilson on social media posted a little shout out because he apparently had thrown a touchdown pass to Pat Fryermuth in minicamp, and they were celebrating. Like,
Nice.
I'm on board with this pick, and I do think that like when healthy, Pat Fryermuth is, a top 10 receiving tight end in this league. Last year, you got kind of that mixed circumstance of bad quarterback play, bad offense, lack of usage in the middle of the field. He wasn't fully healthy. He was dealing with a hamstring issue. Like, throw all of that out the window because I think there's a very, easy realm of possibility where I can figure Pat Fryermuth ranking second in total targets on this team and, you know, easily finishing as a top 10 fantasy tight end for the value that I think you're getting.
Yeah. Yeah, I love his chances here for the upside with especially where he's being drafted. Like I'm with you. I'm 100% all in on a Pat Fryermuth bounce back. And yeah, like Russell Wilson, look, the thing is with like positional target tendencies as well, like personnel and off play call dictate that a lot more than the actual quarterback themselves, right? So when it comes to yeah, this offense specifically, and for the players that they have in that offense, like I think that tight end, for Fryermuth coming in as that tight end and Arthur Smith being the play caller, I think that is the thing to point to more so than Russell Wilson's, target tendency last season for the tight end. So yeah, I'm in 100%.
Yeah, let's
Um,
go.
all right, that is going to wrap up our bounce back candidates. Thank you all for tuning in and or watching on the YouTube, where we do ask that you please like and subscribe. We always appreciate that a ton. But Kate, also a big thanks to you for coming on here, helping me get optimistic about these potential bounce back candidates. Will we get burned again? We'll see. But as always, we appreciate your thoughts, and I'm sure everybody listening does as well. So please do remind everybody where they can find more of you and your work.
Yeah, give me a follow on Twitter at Kate Magdziuk. That's Magdziuk. Catching some of my work over at Pro Football Focus. Obviously, I've got a couple articles coming out on fantasy football strength of schedule. Follow my work for the Steelers at Behind the Steel Curtain. And we'll be back next week to start our positional rankings.
Yes, I can't wait. Writing them up all my rankings and tiers this week for the website, and then yeah, I'm excited to kind of get into breaking them all down on the podcast starting next week. I think we'll start with the quarterback position, and then running backs, wide receivers, tight ends after that. So it'll be fun. Get everybody ready for fantasy season as we've been doing all off season. But yeah, hopefully people check that out as well. So thank you all very much for listening, and until next time, peace out.